Welcome to Unsolved Cases, brought to you by Skoob. I'm your host, Larry Hunter, and today we're diving into a case that shattered a small-town sense of safety, ignited a global outcry, and exposed the terrifying speed at which truth can be buried beneath panic, fear, and prejudice. This isn't just a story of a triple homicide. It's about hysteria, injustice, and a legal system that many say convicted the wrong men. Picture this: West Memphis, Arkansas, 1993. A quiet, working-class community where neighbors wave from porches, kids roam the streets on bikes, and trouble is something that happens on TV, not on your street. But on the evening of May 5th, the lives of three young boys, Stevie Branch, Christopher Byers, and Michael Moore, would be cut brutally short. And the search for their killers would set off a chain reaction of fear, assumptions, and courtroom chaos that still echoes to this day. Their bodies were found the next afternoon, in a drainage ditch in a wooded area known as Robin Hood Hills. What police discovered shocked even seasoned investigators. The boys had been bound, beaten, mutilated. It was a crime so brutal, so senseless, that it didn't just demand justice. It demanded someone to blame. And blame came quickly. Three local teenagers, Damian Echols, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Miskelly, would soon be arrested. Why? Because they were different. Because they wore black. Because they listened to heavy metal. Because in the Bible Belt of the early 90s, that looked a lot like evil. Jesse, just 17, gave a confession after hours of unrecorded interrogation. A confession filled with contradictions and factual errors. But it was enough. Despite a lack of physical evidence, the boys were charged, tried, and convicted. Damien was sentenced to death. Jason and Jesse to life in prison. But as time passed, cracks in the case began to show. DNA didn't match. Witnesses recanted. New suspects emerged. And the world began to ask, had justice been served? Or had three teenagers been sacrificed to public fear and prosecutorial pressure? Today, we peel back the layers of a case that many believe was never truly solved. We'll explore the crime scene, the rushed investigation, the courtroom tactics, and the media storm that turned grief into outrage and suspicion into a conviction. We'll hear from those who still believe the West Memphis Three are guilty, and from those who've spent decades fighting for their freedom. Because this story isn't just about what happened in those woods. It's about what happened after, how communities respond to fear, how easy it is to point fingers, and how hard it is to admit when justice gets it wrong. So, settle in, because today we revisit a case that still divides, still unsettles, and still raises the question, what if we got it all wrong? This is the West Memphis Three, and you're listening to Unsolved Cases with Larry Hunter. Let me take you back to that fateful evening, hour by hour, decision by decision, because sometimes the most crucial evidence isn't what investigators find, it's what they choose to ignore. At exactly 8 p.m., with a full moon rising like some ominous spotlight over West Memphis, John Mark Byers made the call that would change everything. This towering figure, 6 feet 5 inches, over 200 pounds, sporting a distinctive ponytail, stood in the doorway of his modest three-bedroom house on East Barton Street, a working-class area where people minded their own business and trusted that tomorrow would be just like today. When the patrol officer arrived within 10 minutes, she encountered Mark and his wife Melissa, a woman whose hollow eyes seemed to already know that something terrible had happened. Mark did most of the talking, explaining that Christopher had last been seen at 5:30 p.m., tidying the yard like any responsible 8-year-old might do. Christopher was small for his age, 4 feet 4 inches, 50 pounds, with light brown hair and eyes that his parents would never see laugh again. But here's where our story takes its first mysterious turn. At 8:42 p.m., just 42 minutes after that initial missing child report, our officer was dispatched to something that should have sent chills down every investigator's spine. A Bojangles restaurant, where a bleeding black man had stumbled into the women's restroom, leaving blood smeared across the walls like some horrific abstract painting. Think about this for a moment. In a town where nothing ever happens, on the very night that 3 children have gone missing, a disoriented man covered in blood appears at a restaurant just a mile away from where the search is beginning. The restaurant manager described him as mentally disoriented, his face bloodied, his behavior erratic. He'd left just before police arrived, vanishing into the night like a ghost carrying secrets. What did our dedicated officer do with this information? She took notes. She took notes and left. Without investigating further, without collecting blood samples, without interviewing employees in detail. At 9:01 p.m., she walked away from what could have been the most crucial lead in the case to go investigate someone throwing eggs at a house. Eggs at a house. As our lone officer was dealing with vandalism, the true scope of the tragedy was becoming clear. At 9:24 p.m., the phone rang again. Dana Moore, calling from directly across the street from the Byers home, had her own nightmare to report. Her 8-year-old son Michael was missing too. Michael Moore, 4 feet tall, 60 pounds, with brown hair and blue eyes that had last been seen sparkling with the joy of childhood adventure. He'd been wearing his Boy Scout uniform, blue pants, blue Boy Scouts of America shirt, an orange and blue Boy Scout hat, and tennis shoes that would never again run through his mother's house, tracking in mud and memories. Dana Moore's account painted a picture that every parent can visualize with heart-stopping clarity. 3 boys on bicycles, racing through the neighborhood with that reckless abandon that only children possess. She'd last seen them around 6 p.m., riding on North 14th Street toward Goodwin. When she sent her daughter to find them for dinner, they had simply vanished, as if the earth had opened up and swallowed them whole. But the circle of terror wasn't complete yet. Several blocks away, at a catfish restaurant, a second officer was taking another report that would complete this unholy trinity. Pamela Hobbs, working late while her world was falling apart, was reporting her son, Stevie Edward Branch, missing. Stevie, 4 feet 2 inches tall, 60 pounds, blonde hair catching light like spun gold, blue eyes full of the kind of trust that only 8-year-olds possess. He'd left home after school wearing blue jeans and a white t-shirt, riding his 20-inch Renegade bicycle toward an adventure that would end in unimaginable horror. 3 boys, 3 families, 3 lives about to be shattered in ways that would reverberate through decades of legal battles, media scrutiny, and a community's desperate need to make sense of the senseless. The search continued through the night and into the next day, with volunteers combing every ditch, every wooded area, every place where 3 adventurous boys might have gotten into trouble. But nothing could have prepared anyone for what they would find on May 6, 1993. In a drainage ditch in Robin Hood Hills, a wooded area that had become an unofficial playground for local children, searchers made the discovery that would haunt West Memphis forever. The bodies of Stevie Branch, Christopher Byers, and Michael Moore were found submerged in murky water, bound with their own shoelaces, bearing signs of violence so severe that even hardened investigators struggled to process the scene. This wasn't just murder. This was something that seemed to reach into the darkest corners of human imagination. The boys had been hogtied, their small bodies showing signs of what appeared to be ritual mutilation. The crime scene suggested a level of brutality that seemed almost supernatural in its horror, and in a small Arkansas town, where the most exotic belief system was usually just a different denomination of Christianity, whispers began to circulate about something far more sinister. The discovery sent shockwaves through West Memphis that registered on a scale the community had never experienced. This wasn't the kind of tragedy that happened in small towns. This was something you read about in big cities. Something that happened to other people's children. But here it was, in their backyard, in their safe space, shattering every assumption about security and innocence that they'd ever held. Within weeks of the discovery, police had their sights set on three local teenagers who couldn't have been more different from what central casting would order for typical murder suspects. But, in a town desperate for answers, different can quickly become dangerous. Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Miskelly, three names that would become synonymous with one of the most controversial convictions in American legal history. They weren't the obvious suspects. They weren't hardened criminals with long rap sheets. They were teenagers, barely adults themselves, whose primary crime seemed to be not fitting into the conservative mold of their small Arkansas community. Echols, the apparent leader of this unlikely trio, was 18 years old with interests that ranged far beyond the typical pursuits of small-town teenagers. While his peers were listening to country music and planning futures in local industries, Echols was diving deep into literature, philosophy, and yes, the occult. His room was filled with books on Wicca, ceremonial magic, and alternative spirituality. He wore a long black trench coat, even in Arkansas heat, making him stand out like a raven in a field of sparrows. In any other context, in any other time, Echols might have been seen as nothing more than an intellectually curious teenager exploring ideas beyond his immediate environment. But in West Memphis, in 1993, with 3 dead children and a community demanding answers, being different wasn't just unusual, it was suspicious. Jason Baldwin and Jesse Miskelly completed this trinity of outsiders. They weren't the popular kids. They weren't the athletes. They weren't the ones who would grow up to run local businesses and coach little league teams. They were the kind of teenagers who existed on the margins. And in a case where margins were being searched for explanations, they found themselves pulled into a spotlight that would consume the rest of their lives. To understand how 3 teenagers became suspects in a triple homicide based largely on their reading material and clothing choices, we need to understand the cultural moment they were living in. The early 1990s were the height of what historians now call the Satanic Panic, a period when America became convinced that devil worshippers were lurking in every shadow, targeting children for ritual sacrifice. Enter Dr. Dale Griffiths, the prosecution's expert on occult killings, who would provide testimony that sounds almost comical today, but was taken deadly seriously by the court. According to Dr. Griffiths, every element of this crime pointed to satanic ritual: the timing near a pagan holiday, the full moon, the youth and innocence of the victims, the significance of the number 3, and the fact that all victims were 8 years old, apparently a witch's number. Dr. Griffiths saw occult symbolism everywhere. The location near water suggested baptism-like rites or blood-washing ceremonies. The manner of binding exposed the victim's genitalia, significant in ritual-seeking bodily fluids. The removal of Christopher Byers' testicles fit perfectly into Dr. Griffiths' theory of semen collection for ritual purposes. The lack of blood at the scene, obviously saved for future ceremonies where cult members would consume it or bathe in it. The multiple injuries suggested occult involvement, particularly since the left side of the body, associated with evil in Dr. Griffiths' worldview, showed more damage than the right side, which he associated with Christianity. Even a clear spot on the bank became evidence of a ceremonial area in his interpretation. Based on this testimony, the court found substantial evidence of satanic ritual killing. In 2023, such testimony might be laughed out of court. In 1994, it was enough to send a teenager to death row. The trials of the West Memphis Three became a showcase of 1990s justice, where fear trumped forensic evidence, and community pressure overwhelmed careful investigation. In 1994, Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Miskelly were convicted in proceedings that would be studied for decades as examples of how badly the American legal system can fail. 18-year-old Damien Echols received the ultimate punishment: death. He was sentenced to die for crimes that the state couldn't prove he committed, based largely on his interest in alternative spirituality and his nonconformist appearance. Jesse Miskelly received life in prison plus two 20-year sentences. Jason Baldwin was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. For Echols, this meant immediate transfer to the Varner Unit Supermax of the Arkansas Department of Correction, where he would spend the next 18 years in conditions that can only be described as a living death. 23 hours a day in lockdown, 1 hour for exercise, if weather and prison politics permitted. His original execution date was set for May 5, 1994, exactly 1 year after the murders. Imagine being 18 years old and receiving a date for your own death. Imagine knowing you're innocent and watching the calendar pages turn toward that appointment with eternity. Echols later described the experience as being repeatedly punched in the head, a psychological assault that never ended, never allowed for recovery, never permitted hope. The hardest part, Echols would later reveal, wasn't the conditions. It wasn't the isolation or the constant threat of violence from other inmates. The hardest part was knowing he was innocent, knowing that somewhere out there, the real killer or killers were free while he waited to die for their crimes. To understand the true cost of wrongful conviction, we need to follow Damian Echols into the depths of Arkansas's death row, where he would spend nearly 2 decades in conditions that would break most people within months. Death row operates on different rules than the rest of the prison system. It's a world where hope is contraband and time is the enemy. Echols spent 23 hours a day in a concrete cell, allowed out for 1 hour of exercise in a concrete courtyard under a concrete sky. The only windows were slits that showed nothing but more concrete and razor wire. His salvation became books, thousands of them over the years. Reading became his escape, his education, and his connection to a world beyond concrete walls. He devoured literature, philosophy, spirituality, anything that could transport his mind beyond the physical boundaries of his incarceration. But even this refuge came under assault as his eyesight deteriorated from the stress and poor conditions, forcing him to limit his reading to nonfiction books that might help him survive each day. During his 18 years on death row, Echols witnessed the execution of 25 to 30 other inmates. Think about that for a moment. Watching people you've shared meals with, conversations with, years of proximity with, being led away to die. He saw men stabbed repeatedly in prison violence. He witnessed severe beatings that left inmates permanently disabled. He saw a man burned with homemade napalm, his skin melting away, while guards struggled to restore order. Yet perhaps the most surprising aspect of Echols' account was his description of death row solidarity. These men, facing the ultimate punishment, couldn't afford to fight among themselves. They were united against a common enemy, the system that was trying to kill them all. In the most dehumanizing environment imaginable, they found ways to maintain their humanity through mutual support and shared resistance. While Echols, Baldwin, and Miskelly were fighting for their lives in the court system, the investigation had seemingly closed the book on other potential suspects. But for those paying attention, the Byers family's behavior raised questions that the authorities seemed determined to ignore. Mark Byers, Christopher's stepfather, had been the first to report his son missing, which should have made him a hero in the community's eyes. Instead, his actions before and after the murders created a pattern that investigative journalists found increasingly disturbing. Let's examine that crucial timeline again. Byers claimed he sent Christopher to tidy up the carport before leaving to pick up his other son, Ryan. When he returned, Christopher had disappeared. But what happened during those missing hours? Byers claimed he searched frantically, calling police at 8 p.m., but detectives never challenged his assertion that he had driven across the river to Midtown Memphis and back during rush hour in just 1 hour and 10 minutes, a trip that would normally take much longer. More troubling were the inconsistencies in his story. Byers claimed he searched the woods around 8:30 p.m., when it was already dark, wearing only shorts and flip-flops. He said he went back to change into coveralls and boots, which he then wore for the following 2 or 3 days. But he entered these dark woods without a flashlight, only borrowing one after a police officer arrived. The discrepancies in the timeline were glaring. Byers claimed he made phone calls to police around midnight, the same time Ryan said his stepfather sent him to bed. But then, Byers described taking Ryan out for an extended search at Blue Beacon Truck Wash, where they honked the horn and shouted into the woods for a considerable time. These stories couldn't both be true, yet investigators never pressed for clarification. As journalists began digging deeper into Mark Byers' background, a disturbing pattern emerged that painted a picture far different from that of a grieving father seeking justice for his murdered son. By October 1994, just 7 months after the trials that convicted the West Memphis Three, the Byers family was facing a cascade of legal troubles. Criminal charges, restraining orders, disputes with neighbors. Their lives seemed to be in constant turmoil. Police had been called to mediate between the Byers family and their next-door neighbors 8 times in a single month. The catalyst? Mark Byers had hit the neighbor's 5-year-old child with a fly swatter, leaving bruises. When confronted about this, rather than apologizing, the situation escalated into a neighborhood war that required constant police intervention. But this was just the tip of the iceberg. Investigation revealed that Mark Byers had been in trouble with the law since he was 16, when his own parents called police because he threatened them with a butcher knife. In Jonesboro, he and Melissa had been accused of stealing $65,000 worth of jewelry from their employer, a substantial sum in the 1990s that spoke to sophisticated criminal activity rather than petty crime. The jewelry theft case was particularly revealing because it showed a pattern of methodical criminal behavior. When police didn't make arrests, the owners filed a civil lawsuit. The case resulted in the Byers' co-defendants being ordered to return stolen items, suggesting that the evidence was substantial enough to convince a civil court of their guilt. By the end of 1994, the Byers family faced 12 misdemeanor charges for writing over $600 worth of bad checks. Melissa faced aggravated assault charges for threatening a carpet installer with a gun. Mark was accused of contributing to the delinquency of a minor related to a knife fight where a teenager was seriously injured. They were suspects in a motorhome explosion and faced residential burglary charges. This was not the profile of a grieving family destroyed by tragedy. This was the profile of career criminals whose lifestyle raised serious questions about what else they might be capable of. As years passed and the West Memphis Three languished in prison, something remarkable began to happen. Their case became a cause célèbre, attracting attention from celebrities, legal experts, and investigative journalists who saw through the prosecution's thin evidence to the miscarriage of justice beneath. Musicians like Henry Rollins and Black Flag released benefit albums. Documentary filmmakers created the Paradise Lost series, which exposed the weaknesses in the prosecution's case to a national audience. Peter Jackson, the director of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, became so convinced of their innocence that he co-produced a documentary with Eccles himself. But the most significant development came in 2007, when fresh forensic evidence was presented to the court. DNA testing, which had been in its infancy during the original trials, had advanced dramatically. When crime scene evidence was subjected to modern DNA analysis, the results were shocking. None of the genetic material matched any of the 3 convicted men. Think about that. After years of imprisonment, after Eccles had spent over a decade on death row waiting to die, after Baldwin and Miskelly had lost the best years of their lives to prison cells, scientific evidence proved what their supporters had been saying all along. They couldn't have committed these crimes. The Arkansas Supreme Court in 2010 ruled that this new DNA evidence could be considered. The writing was on the wall. The state's case was crumbling under the weight of actual forensic science, as opposed to the superstition and community pressure that had originally secured the convictions. On August 19, 2011, After 18 years, 7 months, and 15 days, Damien Echols walked out of prison. Jason Baldwin and Jesse Miskelly walked out with him. But their freedom came with a price that reflected the legal system's reluctance to admit its catastrophic failure. The West Memphis Three were released under what's called an Alford plea, a legal mechanism that allows defendants to maintain their innocence while acknowledging that the state has enough evidence to convict them. In essence, they had to plead guilty to crimes they didn't commit in order to gain their freedom. For Echols, who had spent nearly 2 decades on death row, the choice was clear: accept the plea and walk free, or continue fighting for exoneration while risking execution. For Baldwin, who had been offered deals throughout his incarceration that would have freed him while leaving Echols and Miskelly in prison, the decision to take the Alford plea meant he could finally save his friends without abandoning his principles. Echols later described both entering and leaving prison as traumatic experiences that left him in shock, barely able to put one foot in front of the other. The world he entered in 1994 as an 18-year-old had changed dramatically by 2011. Technology, culture, society itself had evolved while he remained frozen in time on death row. The Alford plea was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but allowed everyone to save face. The state avoided the massive lawsuit that would have accompanied exoneration. The West Memphis Three gained their freedom without having to wait years more for the legal system to officially acknowledge its mistake. The victims' families were spared a new trial that would have exposed the investigation's failures in even more detail. Today, more than 3 decades after 3 8-year-old boys rode their bicycles into tragedy, the West Memphis Three case stands as one of the most significant miscarriages of justice in modern American history. It's become a case study in law schools, a cautionary tale about the dangers of moral panic, and a reminder that our justice system is only as good as the people who operate it. Damien Echols published his autobiography, Life After Death, in 2012, providing a haunting first-hand account of life on death row. In 2014, he and his wife, who began writing to him while he was awaiting execution, co-authored Yours for Eternity, a Love Story on Death Row, documenting how love can survive even in the most impossible circumstances. The case spawned multiple documentaries, books, and films, including The Devil's Knot, released in 2014. Each retelling of the story has peeled back another layer of the investigation's failures, revealing new evidence of prosecutorial misconduct, investigative incompetence, and the dangerous power of community hysteria. But perhaps the most important legacy of the West Memphis Three case is what it teaches us about the fragility of justice. In a system that depends on the presumption of innocence, the burden of proof, and the careful evaluation of evidence, the convictions of Echols, Baldwin, and Miskelly showed how quickly those protections can collapse under pressure. The Satanic Panic that helped convict them seems almost quaint now, a relic of a more superstitious time. But the underlying dynamics, the rush to judgment, the acceptance of expert testimony that supports predetermined conclusions, the substitution of fear for evidence, these remain constant threats to justice. 3 8-year-old boys died on May 5, 1993. Their killer or killers remained free, unpunished, unidentified. 3 teenagers lost the best years of their lives to a system that valued closure over truth, conviction over justice. And a community learned the hard way that sometimes the monsters we fear most are the ones we create ourselves. The West Memphis Three case reminds us that justice delayed is justice denied, but justice rushed is justice destroyed. In our eagerness to find answers, to assign blame, to restore order to chaos, we can sometimes create injustices that dwarf the original crimes. As we close this examination of one of America's most controversial cases, we're left with uncomfortable questions about our system, our society, and ourselves. How many other Damien Echols are sitting on death row right now? How many other Jason Baldwins are serving life sentences for crimes they didn't commit? How many other Jesse Miskellys have been swept up in investigations that prioritized expedience over accuracy? The West Memphis Three are free now, but their case continues to reverberate through our legal system, reminding us that the price of justice is eternal vigilance, not just against crime, but against the rush to judgment that can turn victims into criminals and criminals into victims. That's our deep dive into the troubling legacy of the West Memphis Three, a case that reminds us how fragile justice can be when fear and prejudice take hold. Three teenagers, convicted in a rush to judgment, spent decades behind bars while questions about their guilt lingered in the shadows. But this story isn't just about a crime or a controversial trial. It's about the dangers of assumptions, the power of community hysteria, and the long, painful fight to uncover the truth when the system fails. If you want to explore more on the evidence that never made it to court, hear from the families on all sides, and understand how DNA breakthroughs and legal battles changed the course of this case, head over to the Skoob app now. You'll find exclusive interviews, case files, and updates on what happened after the convictions. Because this isn't just a story about a tragedy. It's a cautionary tale about justice, redemption, and the high cost of silence. Download Skoob on the App Store or Google Play to unlock the full investigation. I'm Larry Hunter, and this has been Unsolved Cases. Until next time, keep questioning, keep searching, and remember, sometimes the truth is the hardest thing to find.